Okay, well, welcome. My name is Zander Evans, and I'm host of today's webinar. I'm also the executive director here at the Forest Stewards Guild. And today we're going to be talking about conversion. And obviously there are a lot of different meanings of conversion, but today what we're talking about is forest being converted to other things, agriculture, development, that sort of stuff. And I think the first thing that I want to recognize is, I got to get through to my PowerPoint here, that it's a crazy time. It's a stressful time for many of us. The global pandemic is really concerning and is disrupting lives and families and causing a lot of havoc. So by focusing in on something besides COVID-19, I don't mean to minimize the outbreak or refocus or anything like that, but rather life does go on. And for me, this is a sort of welcome distraction to think about some things instead of the pandemic. So I have a nice picture of some forests in Indiana right here, and that's sort of, for me, my happy place, something to think about that gets me away from some of the really troubling worries. So with that, I think I won't mention COVID-19 again during the presentation, even though I recognize that it's probably on all of our minds. And I do want to start, I think probably everybody on the phone knows about the Forest Stewards Guild. Many of you are members. But it is good to just start with a foundation of the Forest Stewards Guild's commitment to practicing on the ground, as well as promoting nationally ecological, economically, and socially responsible forestry. And that's what we do that drives all our decisions. And so if there is a bias in this presentation, it's around that. And I also, as a sort of preface here, want to talk about the FSC National Risk Assessment. So this is the motivator for this particular webinar, although we often think about keeping forests as forests. This particular webinar came out of a response to the Forest Stewardship Council's National Risk Assessment. And I think everybody on the phone knows the Forest Stewardship Council, the sort of gold standard of certification. And they identified conversion of natural forests to plantations and, maybe more importantly, non-forest uses among its key indicators of unacceptable sources for controlled wood. And I'm not going to go into the whole story of controlled wood because that's not the focus today. But if that idea, controlled wood, and as part of FSC certification is new to you, we can maybe address some of that in the questions, or we can provide some resources. In the National Risk Assessment for controlled wood, it covers the whole country. FSC and partners and members of FSC identified the ongoing conversion, so turning forest into other land uses, to be significant in areas of rapid urbanization. And so that's one of the reasons we're not focusing on plantations in this webinar, is because it's obviously plantations and urbanization, that's not a link. It's really about converting forests to homes or businesses or roads or other infrastructure that is more permanent. Agriculture too, but I think the biggest impact around areas that are urbanizing rapidly is for development, for buildings. So that's our focus today. And obviously there are a lot of issues that intersect with conversion. So we'll be touching on some of those, and maybe we'll get to some of those in the conversation and questions and answers. So conversion, this is sort of what conversion looks like. I just grabbed this aerial photo. I believe it's from the Olympic Peninsula, and actually looks like a great place to live. And I should recognize, I live in a home that converted some probably pinon juniper forest to a home. So, and I think everybody on this call lives somewhere that was converted from forest or rangeland to a building, and maybe it happened a very long time ago, or maybe it happened recently. But I think I want to be sure, not, at least for myself, not to be all high and mighty and say people shouldn't live in homes like these, because from the air, my house probably looks somewhat similar. But nonetheless, there are some real impacts of putting homes in our forests. And I'm going to use the term conversion a lot because that was the phrase that FSC focused on in the National Risk Assessment. But we're also talking about fragmentation, breaking forests up into smaller pieces. And that's what we see in this photo, that there are chunks of forest that are now separated by roads or homes or pavement. There's also parcelization. We'll get into that a little bit more, but even some of these areas that are still forest may, on plat maps or ownership maps, be divided up. And the division of forest into smaller and smaller parcels has some real implications, both ecologically, economically, and socially. So we'll touch on all of those, and they're obviously interrelated. You're likely to have parcelization occur before fragmentation or before conversion, and then that adds to fragmentation. So they're interrelated. They're somewhat different concepts, but at the risk of confusing things, I may use them a little bit interchangeably throughout. So this slide is to remind me to talk about why we care about conversion and what values are at risk. And this is sort of the iconic bald eagle that stands as a symbol for a lot of things. In this case, it's a symbol for wildlife, all the values of our forests. As we convert forests to other uses, we lose those values. And there's some really precious things out in the forest. And so that's why we care about conversion. We only have limited forest land in this country. They're not making any more, as the joke goes. And so if we want to protect things from bald eagles to pine trees, we have to be concerned about conversion at some level. And being more explicit about that, keeping forest as forest helps protect clean air, fresh water, carbon storage. Keeping forest as forest provides economic opportunity, and we'll talk more about that. Wildlife habitat is a big one. Ecological processes. So that's a big bundle of things, everything from how water moves to how fire moves, or even how species move across an area, how nitrogen is sequestered, or populations of different species survive. Those are all a little bit harder to get our arms around, but I've rolled up into this ecological processes, or maybe even better said, all the services that forests provide. So we know that's a big bundle, and sometimes the list gets very long, but it's important to think about everything the forest is doing for us and all the pieces we might lose when we convert it to something else. So I'm going to show a couple of maps from work from the Forest Service, David Ware, particularly in 2011, looking at conversion. And the first piece is, okay, well, where are the forests? And this is broken up by county. And I've got two red circles here to kind of keep us focused on two areas of the country. But I know that people are calling in from all over, so you can hone in on your own neck of the woods. And conversion, or keeping forest as forest, looks different in different parts of the country. So today I'll use a number of examples from the Pacific Northwest, and we'll see why in just a second. But so here's where forests are, where the dense forests are at the county level, and you can see sort of rankings here. The darker the purple, the more forest. And now here's population density. So in this case, the bluer the population, bluer the county, the greater the population density. And so staying within those two circles, there are high forest density and high population density. So it's not surprising that when we turn to a conversion map, they also pop up as areas of concern. And I don't want to take away from, say, areas in Michigan or Colorado that that also have this conversion risk, but just honing in on some of these particular areas in the Southeast and Pacific Northwest. So the numbers can be pretty staggering. In this case, the darkest tan is a 25% reduction in forest in those counties. So that's a big change. This is over between 1997 and 2060. So it is a fairly big time period, but nonetheless, this is not a conversion process that goes the other way. So it is a perpetual loss. And I will note just on, because I come out of a research background, that the data on this paper was published in 2011. So we're working with older data. I don't think the numbers have changed all that much, but it would be nice to have an update on this stuff. And it points to the value of Forest Service research that they provide these sorts of things at the national view. There are some other good views, particularly in the Southeast, because when we look around places like Atlanta, we know that this is a real pressing concern. So there have been some studies that have honed in on some of those areas, but nothing that I could find. And if you have better information, please do put it in the chat window. But I couldn't find anything more recent that really took this national view of conversion. So those last sets of maps match up with what the Forest Stewardship Council identified as risk. So this is a map showing the specified risk for conversion from FSC. And I wasn't actually part of those conversations, but there may be folks on the phone who were and might be able to provide us a little bit of background on exactly the methodology that these particular counties were selected. But I think the quick rationale is pretty obvious looking at those last two maps. So there's some areas in the Southeast and in the Pacific Northwest around Seattle and Tacoma. So getting back to the numbers, I mentioned that this looks between 1997 and 2060, and we're likely to lose up to 1.4 million acres of forest to development over that time. And that totals up to 38 million acres of forests that are forecasted to be converted. I think actually, I'm sorry, that first number is rural land more generally, and that second number hones in directly on forests. So again, this is why we care about this. These are big numbers. If we were losing this if there was a wildfire or something that was consuming this much forest, it would certainly be headline news. And I think, although conversion is a slower process, we have to give it that same importance. There are a number of ways of looking at this and trying to identify areas of greatest concern. This is an older study, again, from the Forest Service, Stein et al. In 2005. They looked at watersheds, and so the red watersheds are the highest change, the pink are medium change. And so again, it's a different picture, but I just show this because some of the same areas pop out that we're concerned about, but there are some other areas up in Maine, for example, that we might have missed on the previous way of looking at the data. So I think that this is an important, there are a lot of ways to slice this. Another way to look at it is looking at what we call a wildland urban interface. And for those of you who work in fire adapted ecosystems, this is common terminology, the WUI. We refer to it in quick terms. And the WUI essentially is just homes built into the forest in fire adapted ecosystems. Well, and of course this map includes all ecosystems across the country. But that's another way of measuring conversion or fragmentation, probably better. So even though they're talking about WUI, I would say that the numbers for WUI are a pretty good proxy for fragmentation. And I'll just zoom in on one little area here. I just spotted on the map where you can see a lot of change between 2000. So these are actual maps generated out of a research outfit in Wisconsin, the Silvis Lab. that mapped the whole country and then went back in 2010 and remapped it. So we can see actual change rather than predicted change. And so I'll just go back and forth a few times here. So here's the 2000, and if you look in that red circle, you can see that there's orange obviously is the WUI development, and the darker the shade of yellow to red, the more dense the WUI. And so when we go to 2010, it's expanded in that area. And obviously at this scale, it doesn't look that big a deal, but in that particular neighborhood, I'm sure that it has, is really visible and changes the ecological characteristic. Again, here's 2010 and we go to, or sorry, 2000 and we go to 2010 and you can see that change. So we can make all these various maps available. This particular set of maps is available as GIS data, so you can really drill down to parcels that you're concerned about and get some sense of what's happening in the neighborhood. So I think they're pretty useful. The WUI numbers between 1990 and 2010, we saw tremendous growth. We saw from 30.8 million homes to 43.4 million homes in the WUI. So that's a big growth over just those 10 years of the number of homes in the WUI. And in terms of square miles, it went from 224,000 square miles to nearly 300,000 square miles. So just the area of WUI is pretty tremendous out there. And often we think of WUI in firefighting terms or homes at risk from wildfire, but again, I think it also can be thought of as area at the front edge of fragmentation. So let's drill down into fragmentation. I've been using that word, but we probably need to think more about what it means. So one thing when we have fragmentation, roads are a big part of that. And obviously where we have buildings, that area is converted away from forest. But I bring up roads specifically in the fragmentation context because, and this seems like common sense, but I feel like we need to just lay it out on the table in this context, that because they're so long and impermeable, they are cutting up the forest in a pretty dramatic way, where an individual parcel has sort of a limited footprint and a limited expanding impact, but the road to that parcel may have a much greater impact. And there was a lot of, I actually could have included it in this presentation, a lot of discussion of this around wellheads, fracking wellheads particularly, and sort of the paths and roads to those, because the wellheads themselves were pretty small, but then when you pulled back and looked at all the roads and the trails to get to service them, the impact multiplied out across the landscape. And we know, again, this is common sense for those of us who work in the woods, that the impact of a road isn't just the narrow pavement. It's not even just the right-of-way, but it has a wider spread into the forest. And there's some research that will sort of be integrating into some handouts we're developing on this topic that points to 200 meters from the road actually is influenced by that road. And this image of a bear crossing road is sort of one example where having roads cut through forests or any kind of development cut through forests is impacting habitat. Suddenly, instead of walking through relatively dense forest or protected forest, this bear or any animal crossing this road is suddenly out in the open, and whether it's danger from a truck or predation, it's a different environment for that animal, and so their habitat is reduced. Some animals won't cross roads or are really shy away from traffic and roads. Traffic obviously makes them more dangerous. So reducing habitat is a really important element here. Particularly, I chose this image of a bear because the larger the animal, the larger the territory, the more the roads and fragmentation constrain wildlife populations or wildlife habitat. I'm not a wildlife biologist, but there is some really good research on this topic, and I think we kind of all know it as people who work in the woods. Another thing that is all too common is invasive species, and we know that invasive species follow roads, development, humans in general. They're species that love that disturbance, that love the urban environment or the exurban environment. They thrive on it for a lot of different reasons, whether it's other species don't do as well, or seed dispersal, or they do better in poor soils or other constraints like that. And so this is a one way where the impact of fragmentation in roads really ripples out from the actual area that was converted, say the area that was paved. Well, that's an opening for invasive species and other things to spread out into the forest. So certainly if any of you have worked on invasive species mitigation or eradication attempts, where do you look? Well, you look at roads and even trails. We know that that's how they spread out into the forest. I wanted to tie in animals as well. There are a lot of links here with things like deer. There are animals that do fairly well in our suburban environment. White-tailed deer is one example where, because you can't hunt around homes, obviously, and so there's some protection. They may find food sources in our gardens, and then their populations are unnaturally high, and they can get into a cycle where they promote invasive species because they're eating natives, and you have a real downward cycle that one could argue is driven at heart by fragmentation and conversion. Disrupting ecological processes. Here, this is a fairly rural situation, like there's not a lot of development immediately in view in the photo, but I grabbed it just as an image, as a backdrop for thinking about how processes are disturbed by fragmentation and development. So obviously the flow of this stream is influenced just because there's this road crossing. So it's a pretty minor road crossing apparently from this image, and yet it is going to have an impact, whether it's how floodwaters move, whether it's I don't know if there are fish in the stream, but how the fish move, or other animals that might use stream corridors as travel or migration routes or something like that. So all these things, I mentioned this before, that all the things that move in our ecosystem are affected when we put in more impermeable barriers. Carbon storage, so we're taking out trees, we're removing that storage, we can disrupt carbon storage in the soil when we convert an area. And more importantly, at least in my perspective, is we've lost the opportunity to sequester more carbon in that forest in the future. So one of the great things about forests is they're this awesome mechanism for pulling carbon out of the air, because we have unnaturally high levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere now, which has these other ramifications. So we need trees, we need other plants that pull that out of the atmosphere and sequester it. And trees are awesome because they sequester it in useful ways. So they sequester it in ways, materials that we can then use and store again. So losing that opportunity, it's like losing panels in a solar farm. You've lost that opportunity to pull in that carbon in this case. Human-ignited wildfires, sitting here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is actually a real big concern. It ties back to some of our discussion of WUI earlier. We've seen that where we have more access to the forest, where humans are deeper into fire-adapted ecosystems, there's more chance for humans to ignite wildfires. And often those wildfires are ignited in places and times that are particularly susceptible to large, unmanageable, catastrophic fires. So a good example is campfires that are abandoned in recreation areas on the 4th of July. That tends to be a bad time for fires, particularly here in the Southwest. And even after 100 years or 75 years of Smokey the Bear, people aren't putting out their campfires all the time the way they need to. And so where every time we put a new opportunity for people to get into the forest, we're opening an opportunity for new human ignitions. So that's it's another element of this, and there are probably other things like that that I'm not as familiar with. And so if you have other ideas about how fragmentation is influencing our ecosystems, go ahead and put it in the chat window. Another one that we thought of was the ability to respond to the changing climate. So these are just some maps of predicted potential tree movement. So I couldn't come up with another good image for how trees might move over time, but the idea is that given the warming we've seen over the last few decades, in New England, as in this picture, the habitat is more open for oaks and pines in, say, northern New England than it had been. And so obviously trees aren't going to get up and walk. We're talking about seed dispersal, but even seed dispersal can be hampered as we put in development. If we think about, just a tree shedding its seed farther north, if there's a big development on that northern side, well, that seed's going to land on pavement and it's not going to have the opportunity to kind of slowly move the species forward. Yes, there are other animal vectors, etc., but I think this tries to make the point that this is an issue. It may not be the biggest issue, but it is part of what happens with fragmentation. And it's true for animals as well, to some degree. Economic opportunity. So one of the reasons we value forests and have for millennia is that it provides this economic opportunity. It provides material, it provides jobs, etc. And we lose that when we lose forests. And the other point I wanted to make is we actually lose that more rapidly than just the particular home lot. So obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but we're unlikely to be harvesting timber right around a home. But it's important to remember, and this, I think we probably have people on the phone have some experience with this, even areas that are nearby that may not actually have been developed or converted, suddenly the neighborhood has changed. And it may be less palatable. There may be town rules that get put into effect. There may be just complaints from neighbors. There's a reduction in kind of the critical mass of timber. So it may no longer be profitable for loggers to work in that area. So there may not be an accessible workforce to do the good work in the woods. So that effect, that sort of chilling effect on timber harvest, is out in front of the wave of fragmentation and conversion. And there's some good science on demonstrating that, proving that, and also kind of getting some idea of when it occurs. There's some different numbers depending on where you are in the country, but one study in Georgia was looking at as the population per square mile gets above 200, 250, you start to see sort of a tipping point where the ability to harvest timber in that area starts to decline. And so that has an impact on all of us, whether we're in the timber industry or not. So I'm going to change gears a little bit. We talked about sort of some of the numbers, some of the impacts, and now I'm going to turn to family forest owners. And the reason I'm focusing in a discussion of conversion of forest owners is this is the land that is most at risk. Obviously, federal, there's very little conversion going on there, maybe a few land swaps. Large industrial holdings, yes, we can see some conversion there too, but not at the rates that we see with family forest owners. So we'll talk a little bit more about them. Obviously, they're a very diverse group. in this view, 43% of the forest in the country. The numbers differ depending on which article you're looking at. It's the light green, which is a little bit hard to see probably on this map. So we'll just zoom in again on the Pacific Northwest area here. And so again, we're looking at this light green that's interspersed. And so obviously the dark green, a lot of federal ownerships, corporate ownerships are in orange, but then all around you have this sort of extra line of family forest owners. And so that's a really important part of the ecosystem and our sort of both our economic, social, and ecological view of our forests out there. And I've got some numbers here for Oregon and Washington specifically. We can, these numbers are available from Butler et al. In 2016 for any state. And in these two states, it's about 10% of the forest land is controlled by family forest owners who own more than 10 acres. There's a small wedge of folks who own 1 to 10 acres. So that might raise it to 12%. But that's an important 10%. That's a big chunk. And so really worth thinking about and honing in on. We can look at the range of size of ownerships because we all know that the different sized owners think about things differently. They're different opportunities. And so this chart, it goes from the lightest color is 10 to 19 acres. So 6% of owners in Oregon, just as an example, have 10 to 19. 15 are in that up to 50. 50 to 100 is another 10%. But I think this helps give a picture of how diverse the population of family forest owners are. You can't say, oh, well, they all own all small lots or they all own large lots or anything. It's really diverse. And it is true that almost when we look at this pie, just a quick glance, these sort of lighter colors under 200 acres is almost 50%. So we're not talking about large land holdings in general. And that's something I think is fairly common sense, but it's important to keep it in front and center. So here's a family forest photo with a heroic looking forester from NRCS. What do these family forest owners think about? How do they conceive of their woods? What do they do on them? Well, again, it's very diverse. Probably you could get 10 of them in a room and you get 10 different answers. But when they do a National Woodland Owner Survey every 5 years, we do get some interesting feedback. And so this is from the 2013 survey. Preliminary data is available for 2018. But these patterns, I think, have held true the last few years, last few surveys, that timber is actually fairly far down the list. And things like beauty, wildlife, nature, legacy, privacy, all those things are really top of the list, and high percentages. So I guess I should have drawn some lines here. It's a little hard to tell, but probably over 70% of family forest owners who have more than 10 acres are valuing beauty as a really important or very important objective of owning their land. Whereas timber may be down, at least number of owners is probably down towards 25. Note the blue bars here are the number of ownerships. So that's the number of people. The red bar is number of acres. So this is telling me that people who have larger landownings tend to put timber a little bit higher on their list than other sort of maybe smaller folks who have smaller parcels. That's not too surprising. I think that fits in. So there are some differences there. That same difference appears to be occurring with investment and probably some of these others as well. Wildlife, even there seems to be maybe a little bit of a difference. So I think this gives us a new lens. Certainly, when I started in forestry, this was not how I thought about family forest owners or small woodland owners. I guess just coming into forestry school, I had this kind of like, well, you know, timber and forest management, even if it was with an ecological perspective, was maybe a driver. And I've been trying to recalibrate myself for years on thinking about these other attributes maybe being the drivers. So one of the reasons we focus on family forest owners is that nearly 50 million acres are likely or extremely likely to be sold or passed on in the next 5 years. Now, not all of these transfers will lead to conversion. So this isn't 50 million acres of conversion, but every time a parcel is sold, there is some risk that it's sold to someone who's going to do something different with it. So that's why family forest landowners become important. So if we're worried about keeping forest as forest, and we know that family forest landowners are a place to focus, how do we do that? How do we keep forest as forest? And I'm sort of winding down here. One way is innovative, creative outreach programs like Foresters for the Birds. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Foresters for the Birds program because we had a webinar, I think it was just last week, on Foresters for the Birds, and we can make that recording available. But basically the thumbnail is that Foresters for the Birds is a program developed by Audubon Vermont and Vermont Parks and Rec that has now been spread across the country. A lot of people are picking it up. The Guild is a big champion of this idea. Other Audubon chapters, all kinds of people are saying, hey, this makes sense. And how do we integrate it into what's going on in North Carolina or Oregon or Minnesota? And really it's going out with ornithological experts and foresters and landowners and saying, well, let's look at this forest as if we were birds. Let's think about the habitat. And that can really change the conversation, because as we looked at, many of the family forest owners are thinking about their land as habitat and for wildlife, and wildlife can be really important. And so if you're thinking, well, gee, I want to make my forest better for birds, maybe adding some vertical structure or horizontal diversity is going to make it better for certain species of birds, then yeah, maybe I do want to do that harvest because that's a pathway to get to this improved habitat. Yes, maybe I'll make a little money on it too. Great. Or maybe I can offset the cost of invasive removal or something. And so start to connect with landowners who, if you put out extension newsletters about, hey, come learn about timber harvesting, and say, well, that's not my priority. But if it's come learn about how you can, as a landowner, do better for birds, suddenly you might get a different kind of person interested. Not that any particular interest is better or worse than any other. It's just we know there's a diversity of interests out there, and we need to have a diversity of outreach approaches as well. Another element here is the demographics. So the primary decision makers for a lot of family forests, 43%, almost half, are 65 years or older. And so age becomes a significant reason for sale or transfers. And how we make that intergenerational transfer can be really important, and it can be very difficult. You know, this is actually my grandfather. I couldn't resist putting a photo of him in there. He and I see things differently, right? We grew up at different times. And so if he had land to transfer, we'd have some conversations about you know, how to do it. And now I live very far from him. So that can add to this issue of intergenerational transfers. But there are some tools for that as well. Oregon State University has a really neat program called Ties to the Land. And this recognizes that intergenerational transfers aren't automatic. It's not, I think there was a time when we just assumed, oh, well, it'll just go to the heirs and, you know, no problem. The next generation will pick up where the previous generation left off. And I think the important thing here is to recognize that's not necessarily the case. These families are likely to need help navigating what can be a difficult discussion. There are a whole lot of thorny issues that could be involved. And just assuming it's going to happen naturally is not, we can't do that because it's so important and there's so much at stake in terms of conversion and fragmentation. So there's been some good work adapting Oregon State University's program to Minnesota, and I'm guessing other places as well. So I think that there are opportunities if this is something that you see, oh, wait a minute, this is what my clients need, or this is what our neighbors need. I think there are some materials out there that we can try to share and improve or adapt these programs. So I'm back to this photo, and I chose this photo on purpose. It's a little blurry, but I love it because it reminds me of forestry field trips that I went on earlier in my career. There are a lot of people who look like me, white men, that's, again, not a bad thing, but we recognize that there is a diversity of ownership out here, and this group of folks might not be as welcoming, or might not be a group that other people who don't look like this say, oh yeah, that's how I want to spend my day. And that's okay. This is not a judgment in any way. It's just saying, hey, there's a diversity of landowners out there, the diversity of people interested in this, and we have to connect with them in ways that they respond to well. There are programs for African-American landowners, and here's one that I'll highlight on programs for women landowners. And one of the reasons the Guild particularly is really championing women owning woodlands and other outreach programs is that the majority of family forest ownerships of 10 acres or more have at least one female owner, and women are the sole owners of 31% of ownerships. So there's a bunch of ownerships out there where women are the primary decision makers, and even more where they're part of the decision-making process. And I think it's fair to say that sort of traditionally forestry outreach, forestry extension hasn't connected with women as a group particularly well, or emphasized maybe their perspectives or their interests over others. And so this isn't to say that there's some men in this photo as well. They're obviously, you can have an open conversation, but setting things up in a way, even something as simple as bathroom breaks, making sure that things are set up in a way that are welcoming to different kinds of groups, I think makes a difference when we have a problem as complex as conversion. So Women Owning Woodlands does a great job with this. And I'm actually scheming to perhaps add another webinar to this series that, like our Foresters for the Birds webinar, gives just a real national overview of what Women Owning Woodlands project is like, and how you might be able to bring it to your neighborhood or connect with folks involved. Obviously, there are a lot of other ways that we can try to keep forest as forest. One of them is monetizing those other benefits of the forest. So if we're just looking at forest as a timber value versus the development price, if you sell it for a home, well, that's a tough comparison in a lot of cases. But if we can stack up some other benefits like the conservation easement, the conservation value essentially monetized, or if carbon markets can come into play, suddenly maybe we can make the value on the forest side more competitive with a development price. And another scheme I have in the works where we've actually identified an expert to talk about carbon markets, particularly for family forest landowners in the Pacific Northwest. And so we're going to try to get that on the calendar for April. So kind of winding down here, headed for some questions. I do want to emphasize that many of us are forest managers, and we have a role here too. In area that will remain as forest, this could be an industrial forest ownership, connectivity, habitat, ecological process is still important. If we're losing forest on the edges of some of these larger parcels, it may be incumbent on us to do a better job of maintaining connectivity, habitat, ecological process within our forest blocks. And so I'm guessing most of you already do that, but maybe giving credit where credit is due, that is an important piece of this puzzle as well. The Forest Stewards Guild, as professional foresters, recently put out a policy statement around conservation connectivity. And so that's on our website. And it's got some great points about how, as forest managers, to think about some of this conversion stuff, protecting large interior blocks, being part of networks for connectivity. So things like a vision for connecting the Yellowstone to the Yukon, or Algonquin to the Adirondacks. These are larger than any one ownership, but they help put us in context. Minimize creation of roads, we've talked about that. Animal passage, water flow, these processes. And then the last point is there's a policy element here that's way beyond forestry, that's for our cities and towns and counties to raise our voices to say, hey, look, building downtown makes sense. Can we do developments that provide what we need, housing, in a way that doesn't convert forest? And I think our voices are welcome in those conversations, although I recognize it's a thorny debate. So with that, we'll turn to questions. And I did see as I was talking that there were a number of things coming in the chat window, but not being somebody who can do two things at once, I didn't dare try to read them as they came in. So let's see.
Zander, I can actually start you off with the first question. So Tim Kirkpatrick asked back during the fragmentation section, he asked, is there a higher impact due to road paths bisecting a forest stand or following edge and transitions in vegetation type?
Ooh, that is a really good question, Tim. And I don't know. My instinct is, and I think like yours, that following the edge or the transition probably is better. But I would bet that's something I would have to look into the ecological, it's probably conservation biology literature on that. And I would guess that there's some trade-offs in terms of length and total disturbance. If your straight line is a quarter of the distance of your edge line, well, maybe there's a trade-off there. And there's probably also, whether we're talking about putting in forest roads that are, somewhat temporary and have less of an impact versus a paved road. Yeah, I think there's a lot there. And I think that this is an example of, I think the Guild is definitely open to continuing this conversation. And so if we identify some of these topics and maybe we can find an expert to speak on them, we'd be happy to host another webinar, because yeah, you've gone way past my knowledge.
Great, and Owen Fairbank just added another question, so I think you could read it in the chat box, but I'll go ahead and read it out loud. He says, in Western Washington and elsewhere, we've been using conservation easements that include the sale of development rights, thereby removing the economic pressure to sell for development and assuring the availability for working forests. So it's a comment, but Zander, if you want to talk about conservation easements, this would be a good time.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Owen, for the question, Amanda, for keeping me on target here. So I think Owen has a great example, and we might Owen hosted a field day that looked at some of this that I think I wish I could have attended, because I think sometimes it helps to see it on the ground. But I think his point about assuring the availability for working forest is really crucial, because the sort of early generation of conservation easements, I applaud the cutting edge work that was done probably 30 years ago now, but many of those, the idea was we just have to protect this. And now I think, as per Owen's example, we need to be a little bit more nuanced about it and say, well, gee, if we're protecting this forest, do we also want to protect some of the attributes that I mentioned, like economic opportunity, or even the ability to respond to climate change and invasive species? So if we have really constrictive easements that don't allow us to, say, remove invasive species? Is that going to basically nullify the habitat benefit down the line? If we can't harvest timber, are we adding to that kind of chilling effect of taking that out of production? So I think there's a science, or certainly an art, to writing a good easement, and I am no expert on that part, but making sure that the uses that make sense, like timber harvesting, are on the table, but other things are not, and it is achieving the purpose, particularly for the people who are providing the money for it, is really important. So I think that's another topic where there's some expertise out there, both securing easements, writing easements that allow for some forestry work, and monitoring and maintaining those easements. That, to me, is the real bugaboo, because it goes on forever, and the money, the initial money, may be gone. There was one question that came in privately from Paul about what is the reason for owning 100 acres and larger ownerships. And that is a great question, because I think that this gets to this point about diversity of ownerships. And the data, the survey data, is available online. And so I would be interested, it might be worth, I think I might have the time to go back and cut through the data to look at how some of those opinions change with larger ownerships. Because I think, I sort of hinted at this, I have a suspicion that things like forest management or investment or return on investment from timber might start to move back up the list as you look at larger and larger parcels. So that might change how we do our outreach. And the more, in some ways, it's like the current move to big data for companies marketing soda or vacations or whatever else. They use tremendous amounts of data to hone right in on your interests. And I think in forestry extension and connecting with landowners, we're way behind that. All we have is the National Woodland Owner Survey, but we can do a little bit better job using that data to try to hone in on some of these issues, so that we are targeting our message to the right people in the right way at the right time. Other questions? I know we still have a bunch of folks out there, and you can feel free to put in other things as well, like other webinar topics. We recognize that a lot of us, me for one, I'm giving this webinar from my bedroom. So if there are other topics that should be discussed, let us know. And here's one that came in from Mila. Have you got time to discuss the plantations? Probably not, and actually even more of a limiter in this case is my knowledge. I think conversion from natural forest to plantation, in a lot of ways, is a whole different issue. And so I would hesitate to even wade into that, because I'd probably stick my foot in my mouth real quick. However, I appreciate you raising it, and I guess anybody else who's interested in plantations and that issue of conversion, please do weigh in the chat window. Just a quick note saying, yes, I'm interested in that too, because it might change what we try to address in the future. Afforestation, yeah, a similar challenge. So afforestation differentiated from reforestation. So I've been thinking a lot about reforestation of large, high severity fire areas. But what Mila's point, or Pete is pointing to actually with afforestation, is this foresting of probably agricultural lands or open lands. And that's actually come up in some climate change adaptation planning at the state level. So the Guild's Lake States manager, Mike Lynch, has been looking into a little bit, sort of beginning to cut his teeth on how do we think about that in the Minnesota, Wisconsin area. There's obviously some issues about competition with agriculture. Can we restrict ourselves to areas that aren't well suited to agriculture, and what's the back and forth there? There's some good literature from the Southeast where particularly Bob Apt and some of his colleagues from North Carolina have looked at how timber prices have driven at the margin landowner decisions whether to plant crops in an area or to convert to forestry. And so there's obviously some lag with planting trees, but that's an interesting pattern that might be, if we delve more into that topic, might be a chance to think a little bit about what that looks like more nationally. And I think the right frame for that, in my opinion, would be what are the climate change carbon opportunities, because that could be sort of the funding source for that. Let's see, Zachary put in pretty much every organization in our state is foregoing prescribed burning this year due to social distancing. And I'd be interested in a webinar addressing essentially missing an entire year's worth of prescribed burning. Oh yeah, yep. I think that's something we're all struggling with. Yeah, I think we're actually talking about how best to do that sort of webinar, but I think it's a really valuable topic. So Zachary, thanks for that comment and Tim's additions there. Ashley asked about forest tax laws and incentives to motivate these diverse owners and their values when it comes to different size stands or parcels. So I'll make a few comments there and then admit the limits of my knowledge. So in the research I've been looking at, we know that current use laws that allow forest landowners to be taxed at a forest rate rather than sort of a potential development rate are really important. So those are pretty fundamental to keeping forest land as forest, and they exist. They're usually state-based, and they exist in a lot of states, but I would guess not every state. And so that's a real policy issue, and maintaining those. I know in certain states they kind of come up and there's legislators want to change them or remove them. And so that's a really important piece of it. Other research I've seen is that in general, taxes are not usually cited as the reason for selling or getting, converting land, making a land transfer for forest land. But that said, the confusion and the sort of lack of clarity around taxes and other laws with particularly these sort of intergenerational transfers can be a limiter. And so just because it makes it so complicated. So I think that, that it's a good point, and I think there are ways to focus more incentives and also improve education, just so if everybody had perfect information about what the tax rules were, then I think that would remove one barrier. And because of course tax laws change, I don't even know what the tax law changes from last year did with forest land, but it certainly made the uncertainty greater. Maybe they didn't change anything, but they might have. So another question came in about advice for elaborating women owning woodlands and similar programs, how they can and should be tailored to local and state communities. I think that's a great question. So I'll follow up directly with the person who asked that question, because I think there are a lot of opportunities for that. And that's one of the things we see as a role for the Forest Stewards Guild. You guys are all out doing great work. And sometimes it's just knowing what your neighbor has done or what your colleague in another state has done. Oh, that's a great idea. I can use that here. And so opportunities like this webinar to just try to get the ideas out there. So with that, we're at the top of the hour. So feel free, my email address is on the last slide here. I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. But we will have a recording available. So if you missed part of it, or if you know a colleague who should have been on here, you can share that with them. And as I say, we're trying to do more distance learning opportunities. So look for those in the near future. The easiest way is to join on as a member of the Guild, and you'll get announcements, but they'll also be posted on our website. I didn't get on the ball to get credits for continuing forester education in advance, but I believe that if I send you a sort of certificate that says you attended, if you did attend, I'll check the records, then you can get credits yourself via SAF. So please email me directly if you're interested in getting continuing ed credits. And I really do appreciate everybody joining on. I know that there's a lot going on in the world, and for me, it's actually kind of nice to talk about forests for an hour. So with that, thank you so much for joining in, and we'll look forward to joining together on a future webinar.